I'm just going to introduce our speaker then, so we can get right to the fun stuff. Sharon Hood, over here, is a research ecologist at the USDA Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, Fire Sciences Lab here in Missoula. She studies tree mortality from fire, fire and bark beetle interactions, pine defenses, and treatment effectiveness to improve forest resilience to disturbances and stress. Very, very pertinent stuff. She received a BS in forestry from Mississippi State University, MS in forestry from Virginia Tech, and a PhD in organismal biology and ecology from UM. And with that, I will let Sharon take it away.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's kind of nice to talk about this. Peter asked me several months ago about this is about a 20-year results of a recent paper that came out. And so I haven't had a chance to really present the 20-year results so far. So it's kind of nice putting this together. Okay, so I thought before we talk about kind of the long-term effects of fuel treatments and restoration treatments in ponderosa pine forest, really kind of give some context. And so, okay, so just thinking about restoration of what? And so here the focus is on low elevation, dry ponderosa pine forests, which make up a big part of Western Montana and just the Western United States in general. So I feel like it's important to have some context about how these forests develop, to kind of give some perspective about why we're trying to restore them and what sort of treatment options we're testing or we're using. So, I don't have to tell people in this room who experience the smoky summer in the Western United States that, wildfire is very common. And it's a huge disturbance in the Western US. That map is just showing area burned. And if we add the next 13 years, there would be a lot more red. And so the red line on this graph is the number of fires. So while the number of fires is declining slightly, this goes since 1991 to 2015, the area burned is increasing. So our fires seem to be getting larger. This graph doesn't show that, but a lot of times they're increasing in intensity and severity too. And with that comes the increasing cost to suppress those fires. But when we look at the historical fire regime, this is just a simplified map of fire regime groups showing fire frequency and fire severity. There's a lot of this map is red and kind of salmon color, and that's showing like fires that used to burn every 35 years or even more frequent. So frequent fire was very common in many areas of the US and under low to mixed severity. So that means most of the trees would have survived that fire when we talk about low severity or mixed severity fire. Whereas a replacement severity is almost all the trees are killed in the fire. And so when we have maps like that, and then we know maps of our current structure, we can develop maps like this that show vegetation departure, and these kind of maps provide a kind of coarse scale kind of look about where we can start to prioritize treatments, what forest types and ecosystems are in need of, might be in need of restoration. Because when you have high departure from historical conditions, those are probably more vulnerable to fire or bark beetles or drought, at these stresses that our forests are often exposed to. And so what's changed those historical fire regimes? We hear a lot about organized fire suppression and climate change, and those are definitely the two biggest drivers currently. Before organized fire suppression, just land use practices and removal of indigenous peoples to reservations and banning of cultural burning that caused a huge decline in fire frequency from our from these low elevation dry forests. So, and then just with the introduction of domestic grazing, farming, that just reduced the continuity of fuel. So even before there was organized fire suppression that came on in about mid-1930s, we see a sharp decline in fire frequency kind of in the late 1800s because of farming and just the agricultural practices and domestic grazing. And then our logging and some of our forestry practices, especially early on, definitely a lot of clear cutting, a lot of removal of our biggest trees. So there's a lot that's gone into changing these our historical fire regimes. So I'd like to put this up here because I feel like it surprises a lot of people, but the US is really good at putting out fires. We put out 97 to 98% of all fires every single year, pretty much without fail. And so the fires that do escape are burning under our kind of the hottest, driest, windiest conditions. And those are the ones that are really driving those big acres and area burned that you see. So most of the fires are put out, whether before they reach 300 acres, and so those remaining two that's what's driving all the suppression costs, the bulk of area burned, and to where we're spending billions of dollars a year putting out fire. And so we think about forest management practices of cutting or prescribed burning, but we often don't think about this action of putting out fires. That's a direct management action, and it has consequences on our forest structure, fuels, and how these forests are burned. But we don't really think about it because we don't half the time don't even see like these real small fires getting put out all the time. So this is a summary of over 800 fire history studies in the Western US. And it shows clearly the change in fire frequency in the West. So if you look at the x-axis, on the right is current time, and it goes back to 1600. And on the y is just sites recording fire, so our tree ring studies. And really just want to call your attention to, you see a ton of squiggles of that black line. It's going up and down. The red numbers show years of high fire frequency, the blue years of low fire frequency. But then when you get to about 1880 and in that green hashed area, you just see there's a really big change from the previous 380 years. You don't see any more of those peaks anymore. And this is just showing like how consistent our fire history studies of 800 individual studies of seeing this decline in fire frequency since 1880. So even though we have a lot of area burned in the US, it's not near the amount that it was prior to European settlement. And so thinking about the consequences of that change in fire frequency in our low forest, it's a different story in some of our other forest types. So I definitely am going to make sure I'm focusing in not here on our dry or low elevation forest. But when we exclude frequent low intensity fire, that comes along very predictably with an increase in tree density. So there's just going to be more trees establishing. Those trees that do establish are more shade tolerant, so they're going to grow better under low light conditions. And with that just come feedbacks to when fires do occur, how those forests burn. This is I think it's probably the longest photo series that I know of. It's down in Lick Creek on the Bitterroot National Forest, right outside near Lake Como. There's several photo points in this, so I just picked one, but these three pictures are all taken from the same point. And the first picture, it's not meant to show a pristine, untouched forest, because first of all, there's, we know it wouldn't have been untouched. Native Americans would have been actively burning this area for, very intentionally and for a variety of purposes. But they took this picture because this was the site of the first large timber sale on Ponderosa pine in the newly established Forest Service northern region. So it was a big deal. Gifford Pinchot came out with a professional photographer and took this picture to highlight, the forest management practices and the cutting. So there are some piles there. That area, it's been cut at this point in 1909. But you can see there's still big pines. It's still open. At that time, utilization was pretty low, so there's not a lot of wood down, suggesting that they didn't cut a ton. But this photo series is just meant to show how trees grow in the absence of fire and with cutting. So that middle picture, 49 years later, that's big tree that's in the center at 1909 has been cut, which is very common. A lot of our biggest trees have been cut, but you can already see the forest is getting denser. There's starting to be more Douglas fir. By 106 years later, you can't even see the larger trees in the background. I know it seems fairly obvious, but but trees do grow, but they grow at a slower rate to where sometimes we don't really, I feel like, see the forest, how much the forest is changing, compared to our lifetimes. This is just one more summary just to kind of show again how much we've changed the fire regimes in the Western United States and the consequences of that. So the map is showing areas of dry mesig mixed conifer forest in the brown. And the left bars is reference conditions, kind of the late 1800s versus current, which I think is about 2015 timestamp. And really what this is showing is that we've lost a lot of our older forest. And so we have much more forest of kind of middle-aged. And then when you look at cover, our forests have gone from much more open forest in the past to more to closed conditions. So, and we know kind of that is directly because of a change in fire regime, and that we've removed that frequent low severity fire from these kind of systems. So, this again, when we change the fire regime, we're changing forest structure and composition. So that really changes how these forests burn and the effects of those fires. So, this ponderosa pine forest, on surface fire on the left, those forests are really adapted to survive this kind of fire. They have thick bark. By the time they get larger, their crowns are higher and kind of more open. They can easily withstand that kind of fire. They cannot withstand a fire like on the right. So all of our trees in the Northern Rockies will be killed by when there's torching and crown fire. So it's not that a species species do have adaptations to fire, but they have adaptations to certain types of fire. So that how the forest burns is really important for rather than just if it burns or not. And so also instead of just changing the fire, just changing how fires burn, it also, when we change the fire regime, we know we have these cascading consequences of changing how resilient forests are to drought and to bark beetle. So this is a picture during the extreme drought in Southern California in 2012 to 2016. And there's almost complete 100% mortality in the ponderosa pine because of a western pine beetle outbreak and an extreme drought. And that's really, we know these forests would not have been this dense, 100 years ago. And so that brings me to the study that I was going to focus on today, which is part of the National Firefighter Surrogate Study. This study started in 1999. There were 12 sites. It was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. And what all these 12 sites have in common is that they're all in ecosystems that historically had frequent low severity fire. So we're lucky in this area to host the Northern Rockies Firefighter Surrogate Site, and it's at Lubbock Experimental Forest. You probably can't see that text there, but the fire return intervals like every 15 years or 2 to 25 year timeframe. So these forests were burning, again, very frequently. The main objective across the 12 sites was there was a fuels reduction and kind of objective, and then a restoration objective. So they wanted to design treatments that if a wildfire occurred, 80% of the overstory trees would survive, but they also wanted to restore forest structure and function into a lot of these areas by adding, and whether we could do that with fire or mechanical treatments. And so kind of zooming into the Northern Rockies study, again, there are 4 treatments here. There's the control, the burn only, a thin only, and a thin and burn. So it had been about 80 years since the last fire in these study sites, and they were thinned in 2001 and prescribed burn in 2002. And I'll just tell you now that there was a mountain pine beetle outbreak that started at about 2005, and that becomes relevant for a lot of the results later. So this was a pretty massive study. It was started before I came here. I helped with some of the prescribed burns. So I came to the fire lab in 2001, but the treatments had already been cut. And Carl Fiedler was the principal investigator from that started the study, and there was a big team from university faculty and also Mick Harrington at the fire lab. So it was a big team effort. And this is just the study layout. That squiggly line, that's Highway 200. And so there's 3 replicates of each of the 4 treatments, and each of these, each of the squares, each of the treatment units are about 22 acres in size. And here's just a brief bit about the treatment prescription, that was over the winter of 2001, cut to a basal area of 48 square feet per acre, if that is relevant for people. But the cutting prescription was trying to favor leaving ponderosa pine and western larch, again, because we know with the historical fire regime, that's what the species would have been the dominant species. And then, cutting mostly Douglas fir. Wanting to leave larger trees, really trying to push these forests to a multi-age structure with kind of a more heterogeneous spatial structure, and having more ponderosa pine regeneration, and then also larger trees. And then we did broadcast prescribed burning in the spring of 2002. And so there's a ton of plots out here. It was, again, a really big effort. I focused on the trees and doing all the post-fire injury assessments, but there's also seedlings and saplings, understory plant cover, fuels. And then these were measured pre-harvest, post-harvest, post-burn, and then at 4, 10, and 20 years post-treatment. And Kylie back there got to help with a ton of the 20-year measurements and spent a lot of time out there. So just for the rest of the talk, just kind of wanted to give you a brief summary of kind of what we've learned over the 20 years and kind of where the study is now. So I wanted to start off with the resilience of the treatments to a mountain pine beetle outbreak, which was not anywhere on people's radar when this study was first developed. But it became, it's a very large part of the story now. Probably many of y'all are familiar with mountain pine beetle, but it's a native insect that's capable of, causing massive amount of tree mortality. So these beetles attack living trees. And so that's why like Dendroctonus literally means tree killer in Latin. So these insects, I mean, they're tiny, about the size of a grain of rice, but they work cooperatively to attack the trees. And that center picture shows a tree with that gooey pitch around the beetle is the tree's resin, which is the main defense of pines. And if there's enough resin exuding out, then beetles are able, the tree's able to pitch out those beetles and resist the attack. But if there's enough beetles in the area or the tree's stressed, then there's not enough resin. Those defenses can be overwhelmed, and the beetles then reproduce in the trees and then go on to attack neighboring trees. So starting about 2005, the whole Western Montana, Northern Idaho was part of a massive outbreak. And that's what's shown in red. It's parts of our forest that were affected by mountain pine beetle during that time. And the little inset shows you could see the three blocks here. And this is just to show that these treatment units were all challenged by the beetle, which is pretty rare. Like we don't have many studies where we can, where the treatments are in place and then an outbreak comes along and we can actually measure what happened. So much of the time we're kind of limited to modeling and kind of predicting what we think may happen. So it was a pretty amazing opportunity, one of the only studies that we could definitively ask if these treatments that were fuel treatments and designed to resist or to mitigate against high severity wildfire would also be effective at reducing the severity of a mountain pine beetle outbreak. So this is just a heat map of the 3 treatment blocks and each of the 4 treatments in those blocks. And really the warmer colors are where higher mortality occurred in the ponderosa pine. And again, this is just to show that there's mortality across all 3 of the blocks, and most of the mortality is concentrated in the control and burn only treatments. And so those black dots are tree plots. And so when we crunch all the numbers and look at ponderosa pine, we have all the trees greater than 4 inches tagged. This is the mortality that occurred during the outbreak. And so these box plots, I mean, they show there's big ranges, but if you look at the thick black bars, that's the median values. So 50% of the ponderosa pine was killed in the control by the bark beetles, compared to 18% in the burn only. And in the thin and burn, it was 0. So it just, these were, I mean, it was just remarkable how much the treatments reduce the severity of the outbreak. And so this led to the question of, why, what's really going on. And a lot of this is related to, again, pine defenses. And so that the pines have this whole network of resin ducts, and they're horizontal and vertical ducts. It's like this tubing system throughout the wood of the tree. And that's what's shown by in this wedge here. You've got these like horizontal ducts, and this is like vertical ducts going down. And then this is the xylem of the tree, but the blue stain is the resin ducts. And so resin ducts are important because those blue cells of that ring are where resin's actually made, and then it's stored in the center. And then it's also the delivery system. So when you have bark beetles boring into this ponderosa here, it severs the resin ducts, and then the resin can start to ooze out and try to pitch out those beetles. So because it's the site of, it's where resin's made and stored and delivered, it's a really good indicator of a tree's defense. And what's really nice about it is that they're embedded in the wood of the tree. So just like with the tree ring studies that talk about where we can build our fire history studies or tree growth, we can also see how resin ducts and defenses have changed over time. And so what we found at Lubrecht is this is tree growth, so just how much the trees are growing. It's 10 years after the treatment is the time period with those, you can see the black arrows or the treatment timing. So the pink and green lines are the thin only and thin and burn. And so you can see the thinning, it's not a huge surprise. You thin the forest and the trees start growing a lot faster. But what we also found is that also caused a big increase in total duct area. So the trees that are growing really fast are making more resin ducts. And we know that the more resin ducts you have, the more resin. There's been other studies to show how tightly correlated that is. And so that these trees are, the trees in the thin and burn are just, they have more defenses. So to be able to pitch out the beetles. And so this is just a snapshot of what the treatments look like 15 years post-treatment, 3 years post-outbreak. That outbreak, again, by causing so much mortality, you now have a ton of snags. Most of those have now fallen so you have just a lot more logs on the ground and a big shift of, instead of being dominated by ponderosa pine, the control units are actually dominated by Douglas fir now. The burn only is just kind of in between, it caused quite a bit of mortality. And again, there's just a lot more. It's about 50-50 ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The big difference between the thin and burn and thin only is just that all the little trees, that were there after the harvest, these little seedlings, 20 years later, those grow up. And so now you have just a much denser understory and kind of what we call ladder fuels there's more fuels connecting from the surface to the canopy and also horizontally. So it's would be a lot easier for fire to spread under an extreme weather day compared to the thin and burn. It's still fairly opening. We're starting to get some regeneration developing, but it's lasting a lot long. That burn that killed all the smaller trees, it's keeping that forest more open and lasting longer than just the thin only. Okay, so just kind of, that's the background about that I needed to cover about the outbreak, and then just kind of get into some of the 20-year results. Okay, so this is basal area, so how much wood, cross-sectional wood is out there per, I put most of these graphs, I'm sorry, are in metric, but I put some English units too next to it. This is 2002, a year after the treatment, and the purple bars are, the basal area that's alive. So as you would expect, the control and burn only have higher basal area. A lot of these plots now, it's like switches to mechanical and mechanical plus fire for the paper, but that's the same as thin and burn. So you can see how much was harvested. About half of the trees were cut, about half of the basal area in the thinning. It was a commercial thinning. And then the green bars show how much mortality occurred in the burn. So not much mortality. And 2020 is kind of where we're standing like where you can see the, a lot of growth has occurred over those 20 years, but then that the top color, orangish color, shows the mortality that occurred mostly from the mountain pine beetle outbreak. And yeah, so that's kind of those, again, the purple bars, and just looking at that, you can see the thin and burn still has much lower basal area compared to the control and burn only. Looking at, this is native plant understory cover and non-native on the right. And kind of what we saw here, kind of the big take home, is that we saw this spike of increased cover of non-native plants in the first 4 years after the fire, in the thin and burn, our first 4 years after treatment. And that's what the blue line is, the thin and burn. But that kind of just has tapered off, and it's still statistically higher, but than in the thin and burn compared to the control and burn only, but it's still, it's about 0.5% cover of non-native species, but it still is higher, and that 20 years later. And also it's a concern for, or something we definitely want to watch as far as when we do future treatments, would that higher level, are they kind of poised to just really take over again, or would we see an increase and another decline? And this is just richness by, it's just by genera, not to the species level, but again, it's the same thing with this spike in non-native richness the first 4 years, and then a decline. But in our natives plant, there weren't strong treatment effects with the native richness and cover. So moving to fire hazard. So this is, there's a few different ways to look at this. And this is, again, a modeling exercise, because we haven't had a wildfire to really see what would happen in real life. So this is probability of torching. By torching, I put a picture up on the right. That's just when individual trees or group trees are just, it's going all up in flames. It's a type of crown fire versus, like, sometimes you have, big crown fires. But, we have concern about torching, because that's when it's much harder to control these kind of fires. They're throwing a lot of embers. So you have, the fires can grow faster. You're going to have more tree mortality. And so thinking about how easy it is for a forest to torch under kind of weather conditions that we'd see in the summer. This is the same, like the box plots that you saw before with those bars are the median values. And so this is 2002, 1 year after treatment. And what kind of the take home, and no surprise, is that the thin only had, the thinning increased the chance of torching. And that's because we didn't, we cut the trees, and then the slash is all on the ground. There wasn't a fuel treatment in that thing. Like we changed the canopy fuels, but we increased the surface fuels. So right after the treatment, the thin and burn has the lowest probability of torching, but the thin only has the highest. 20 years later, things are a lot different. The fire, it's very heterogeneous, and that's what we see with this huge spread of in the box plots, and each of the dots are different plots. But there's it's predicted that there would be quite a bit of torching in the control and burn only. Those bars, the median values are upwards around, I think, 0.4 in the control, versus close to 0 in the thin and burn. And things are kind of similar in the similar levels as to 1 year post-treatment in the thin only, but for a different reason. So in 2001 or 2002, right after the treatment, there would be higher probability of torching in the thin only because you've got all that slash on the ground. 20 years later, it's because all those little trees have grown up. There's been quite a bit of decomposition of the slash, and the fuel loading is low, but it's now because you just have a lot more ladder fuels compared to the thin and burn. And so what that means, with the torching, it equates, then we can predict tree mortality. And so again, these are set up the exact same way, right after the burn, or right after the treatments. Again, we'd expect to, if a fire had occurred, we would have expected the most mortality in the thin only treatment, again, because it's more likely to have torching. But then 20 years later, the thin, and the main take home is the thin and burn is just lasting much longer as a fuel treatment, compared to the other, compared to the burn only or the thin only. That's the only treatment where we still think that if a wildfire occurred, you would have less than 20% mortality, which was the overarching goal of the whole firefighter surrogate to begin with. So how long these treatments last is a big deal, just and to understand, because adding a prescribed burn adds cost, it adds complexity, but there's such a vast area in need of restoration. It seems to pay off by adding that prescribed burn, because it's buying you longer time of being effective against a high severity wildfire. Yeah, that's just some of in a picture of the thin only, like showing those little trees growing up. Okay, so I think this is like the last kind of data slide I have, talking about stable carbon, because carbon is such a big issue, and about it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue about how should we be managing our forest with a carbon objective, and should we be managing for maximum carbon, or do we need to think about the likelihood of disturbance, and how that may in this case, the likelihood of a high severity wildfire occurring, and maybe we want to have managed for slightly lower carbon stocks, to where if a fire does occur, we don't lose all of our carbon. So there's a lot of conversations and different perspectives about, managing just for carbon forgets about all the other important benefits that a forest offer. So when you talk about stable carbon, this is adding that probability of mortality in the fire modeling of, like, if a wildfire were to occur, how much stable carbon would remain after the wildfire. And so again, this is 1 year after treatment, and no surprise, just there's more basal area in the control and burn only. Those have the highest stable carbon, because it's still outweighing the higher tree density is still more beneficial than the amount of mortality that would be predicted to occur, that was predicted to occur. 20 years later, that's kind of flip-flopped to where, especially because of the mountain pine beetle outbreak that caused so much more mortality and the heavy fuels, you see all these, the dots and the medium bar and the control and burn only is like, there's almost zero stable carbon. We're expecting almost, if a fire to occur, almost all the trees would die, so you wouldn't have any living carbon. You'd have plenty of carbon in your dead trees, but you're not growing and sequestering more carbon, compared to the thin and burned that have a higher stable carbon if a fire were to occur. And that's because we'd expect more trees to survive. Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of kind of, again, where we are 20 years post-treatment. A lot of kind of similar to the previous pictures I showed you of, again, the thin and burn, still pretty open, whereas you can that picture with the on the mech slide, I feel like this one really shows how much all these little trees, this is the same photo point, you know, how much they can grow and really change the fuels. So another, I feel like, huge benefit of the firefighter surrogate is that it's close to Missoula, and we get a lot of groups coming. The Lubrecht Experimental Forest hosts just a lot of groups, and then they're looking for something to do. So we give a lot of tours out there. And so, you know, about starting a couple years ago, you know, we're having more and more tours and really thinking, like, we know we're on the upper end of the fire return interval. You know, what should we be doing? You know, maybe this study, we know now the 20-year effects. You know, to keep this relevant, we should probably think about having a second treatment and really looking at kind of the effects of those maintenance treatments and multiple treatments over time. And so that's what we did. We kind of launched the next phase of the firefighter surrogate study that I hope will keep it relevant for the next 20 years. The thin and burn was, we had a second harvest in 2023. It was also a commercial harvest. And this is what it looked like in the thin only. And so to kind of test more of a thin only fuel treatment, you know, and get rid of a lot of these smaller trees that were, because a commercial tree is 7 inches and greater. So to get rid of some of the smaller submersible trees, we decided to do a mastication treatment in the thin only, so that it would be a true fuels treatment. So mastication is, you're not removing the fuels, you're rearranging them to where they would, hopefully they'll burn less intensely. So there's, that's the masticator. It's like this giant lawnmower that just goes around and can kind of shred all the trees down and some of the smaller trees. And so, yeah, a picture of kind of right after mastication of a particularly heavy area. But it wasn't feasible to try to do any like hand slashing, or we kind of felt like mastication was our only option. Just the density was so high, those smaller trees. And then this past April, we burned it was over 3 consecutive days in the burn only and the thin and burn. And this was a really big effort with a ton of folks, Nature Conservancy, Forest Service. So it was really cool to bring all the groups together and get it just done in 3 days. Yeah, I just have pictures from now out. We haven't crunched any of the numbers yet. The crew it was a really intense summer of getting all the a full remeasurement of the whole study. So this is in the burn only, and I feel like, you know, we definitely will have more mortality with this burn than we did the first burn. And this is just the challenge of doing a burn only versus doing a mechanical treatment beforehand. You're never going to get as precise of results as you do when you have a thinning first. You know, you can see all those logs on the ground that were from the outbreak, that were, you know, they were killed by the beetles during the outbreak. And, you know, when all those logs are getting consumed, they're producing a ton of heat. So, you know, we know a lot of those trees will die, but we also were trying to break up the forest and in the burn only and reduce density. So we did want some mortality, but we might have gotten a little more than we wanted in this unit, but we'll see. This is the thin and burn. And again, you can see it's just so much easier to implement a prescribed burn and a mechanical. If it's been mechanically treated, you just have, you don't have as many ladder fuels, and you can really just control your intensity a lot easier. This is also the thin and burn. So I feel like we got really good effects in the thin and burn. You know, it was spring burn, so it's patchy. We didn't want it to burn 100%. We wanted to kill some of the region, but not all of it. Yeah, so I feel like those are looking good. You know, the burn onlys, again, they're really hard. This is also another burn only that has more Douglas fir in it, and it didn't burn as much as we wanted it to. Again, it's that the challenge of prescribed burning. It's kind of a blunt force tool. It's not going to be as precise as a thinning. So here, like it was having this area like kind of hard to get the fire going and really to spread. Yeah, so just in closing, it just kind of like hopefully I've kind of given you a better understanding of like why we do some of these restoration treatments and really trying to put them in context of the historical fire regime, and that guides a lot of our objectives. We've definitely learned that it had been at that point about 80 years since the last fire, and especially the burn only, we just can't expect one treatment to get us to the where we want to go. It's going to take multiple entries, and yeah, just curious to see how those develop over time with additional treatments. And then thinking of when we talk about restoration treatments and fuel treatments, these again are frequent. They historically burn very frequently, so we wouldn't expect like one treatment to work and then walk away and you're done. This is it needs maintenance treatments and to have a cycle of treatments, just like you would have with repeated fire, or if you're in an area where you could allow natural fires to occur, but that's oftentimes a lot more limited. We definitely learned, like with the, as far as like the resilience to the mountain pine beetle outbreak, that having those treatments implemented, before the outbreak occurred, I think, and being proactive about that was a big part of why those treatments were so effective against the outbreak. I'm not sure we would have had that same level of success if we had tried, like the outbreaks occurring and you run out there and try to do the harvest. So trying to think, we're trying to manage our forest, for disturbances as they come along, and we're not sure when they're going to come along, but you're trying to I guess, hopefully it's to try to manage proactively rather than reactively to, when we have our, once you have an outbreak occurring or you have a large fire, you're really limited in your treatment options. And then again, I just want to point out that it's not like a one size fits all, like these silvicultural treatments, like you can kind of, there's a million different ways to define and kind of the nuance around the prescriptions. So, I mean, these are the prescriptions are the results from the prescription of this study. I feel like they're common treatments and common prescriptions for this kind of ponderosa pine Douglas fir forest. But, you see, there's a lot of different terminology in forestry, but it's really, the prescriptions are what's really describing what was happening on that area versus, and will tell you kind of why, like a commercial thin versus a non-commercial thin and some of these other terms. So, we're able to really, there's a lot of variety in the prescriptions that are out there, and that will change the outcome of these treatments too. And so that's all I have. So thanks for listening.